All right. On today's podcast, we are doing another A Day in the Life. I want to give a shout out to Ben Velazquez for coming on and talking about concussions. I thought it was a very interesting conversation. I definitely learned a lot. I bounced off stuff that I had heard, presuppositions off of him and got some stuff debunked, and that's great. That's what these interviews, these A Day in the Life interviews are kind of all about, is to learn more about a particular field that's kind of within MMA, but not a fighter, right? Like you want to learn about something else. So he taught us all about concussions, which unfortunately is 100% unequivocally a part of MMA, and it's not necessarily that big of a deal. It can be managed, it can be mitigated. So really just knowledge is power, and the more knowledge we have, the more we're going to be able to mitigate that and have a safe sport moving forward. So I think Ben is definitely doing a good job with that. Go find him. Shout out to Brian Levick. I appreciate you getting me in contact with Ben, and also getting me in contact with other people as well. I really do appreciate it. Go check out Brian Levick. Great guy. He does the social media and stuff for Titan FC. I think he does more than that, but that's what's jumping out at me right now. So shout out to Brian. All right. Enjoy the episode.
You've got a gun. Got a big gun, got a gun, it's not a real one.
All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of the LoudMouth MMA podcast. Today, another installment of the A Day in the Life series, and I have a great one. I have Ben Velazquez, who has become sort of a concussion expert. There's a lot of other things he's done, and I'm going to have him tell you because I will miss probably quite a few things. But Ben, I am very thankful that you took the time out to talk to me, and let's get into concussions, man. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me on, buddy.
For sure. So, for our listeners, go ahead and give us some stuff you've done. Give us your credentials, your accolades. Kind of go through that for us, and then we'll proceed.
Okay, so a brief history. My background's in engineering, attaching aeronautical engineering, and I changed gears after university, and I went back to school and studied physiology. And for the first, I would say, half of my career, I did kind of athletic preparation, strength and conditioning, kind of standard work with athletes, getting them ready for whatever their sport was, consult teams, that kind of thing. Then I quickly realized that there was no such thing as a healthy athlete. And I went back and took an unaccredited course out of France in more performance rehabilitation. So I work with athletes post-injury or post-surgery where there is a huge gap between what's done with the athlete right after surgery and for PT and kind of getting them ready for the field. There was a huge divide between, the athlete having normal mobility, normal range of motion, strength, and then actually being ready to get back to their sport. So fast forward, I did that for about 6 or 7 years, mostly orthopedic stuff, knees, shoulders, hips, low back stuff with various sports. And then the concussion thing exploded, and it exploded in the media. And I decided when I eval my guys, I'm going to poll and see how many of my guys that are coming in have had, concussions. And the number was astounding. It was close to 80% of the athletes that came in had one or more concussions. So I started diving down that rabbit hole and kind of looking at it from a different perspective. How can I help to lower the risk, no matter what the sport? And if a guy's been banged up a few times, meaning concussed, then, what's the best way to rehab them? And where do the mechanics play a role? Where does the exercise play a role? And that's where we are today.
And so one of the things you said is that there's no healthy athlete, which I love that because that is incredibly true, and it's true across all sports. You're basically it's and you kind of this is what you said, but there's no such thing as being healthy. It's whether you're healthy enough, deemed healthy enough to do this thing that you do, play this sport that you play. But other than that, you're not actually healthy. Your knees are still what they are. Your elbows are still what they are. Your neck is still what it is. That stuff doesn't really get fixed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it's very misunderstood, even in sports themselves. I often lecture, and I start my lecture off by saying sport is sport. sport's not health. It has nothing to do with wellness or well-being or anything associated with, with that. It's about competition and winning and having, and just the act of being a competitive athlete, especially at a high level. Not to mention in a sport like MMA, it has nothing to do with health. It has everything to do with being able to get back in the octagon.
And there's this monkey dance aspect too, where fans expect the world from you, and you're not giving yourself time. And you see that in fighting. We're seeing an uptick in it, especially because fighter pay is becoming more and more of an issue. The spotlight's becoming more and more on that, and the brighter that spotlight, the more fighters are saying, well, I got to fight all the time now because you guys aren't paying me enough. Whether that's true or not is really here nor there. That's how fighters are reacting to it. So you're having guys like Donald Cerrone fighting as much as humanly possible, right? You're going to see, obviously, Sam Alvey's about to set the record for a year. Now, he hasn't taken too much damage, but still, you're seeing an uptick of fighters taking more and more and more fights, and I think a lot of it's pressure from the fans to try to set records, to try to distinguish themselves from the pack. And obviously in football, man, if one of those football players takes a game off when the fans think that they could do it, they are never going to hear the end of it.
Oh, yeah, I tell everybody with regards to football, because we hear that a lot. I just say, listen, if you have any questions about football and collisions and concussions, just stand on the sidelines for an NFL game. It's like, watching a car wreck, however many times a game. And that's the nature of it, basically.
I heard, and I in my very limited understanding, I think that this is helpful. But what I heard is in football, so let's compare rugby and football. Okay, rugby on the surface is so much more violent on the surface. Okay, if you're just looking at the two things. Rugby seems so much more violent, and they're not wearing pads. So to the eye, it just looks that much worse. Yet ACL tears aren't a thing in rugby, at least not really. From anything that I've heard, concussions are almost non-existent. They, of course, exist, but they exist in every sport everywhere, right? Even the sports that we deem to be safer than others, you still have concussion problems. That's still a thing. You get concussions in baseball and stuff. That's just a thing that happens. Anytime you're using your body to run 17 miles an hour, right? Things are just going to happen. But anyway, so I've heard the reason why injuries are so much more limited in rugby is because they're not wearing pads. So by not wearing pads, their natural instincts are keeping them from colliding their heads, and they're keeping them from putting all of their force into a tackle, right? They're not putting everything into it because their bodies are saying, oh yeah, you're not all padded up. So in football, because they wear pads, they get it in their minds that they're invincible. I have a helmet on. I'm invincible. I'm going to slam my helmeted head into this dude's helmeted head at full speed because it's a helmet. I'm fine. And that's what's causing concussions. Do you think there's some validity to that? That maybe that's why you're seeing so many concussions in something like football versus sport like rugby?
Yeah, there's actually a bunch of groups that are looking at that statistically, because obviously they can't do, academic studies and concuss athletes one way or the other, so they have to look at the data. But yeah, the belief is that because athletes in a sport like football have helmets and pads, they're more likely to use their bodies as a weapon rather than to alter their tackling,
use proper form,
contact techniques. Exactly. So they instinctively will alter their tackling techniques, or they learn as they learn the sport. Whereas with football, there's a higher likelihood that at a high speed, you're going to be using your body as a human missile. And there's also helmet-to-helmet contact, and the level of impact is higher. In fact, that was the theory behind the USOC eliminating the headgear in amateur boxing, was that they found that there was quicker knockouts, and there was also there was a greater emphasis paid on defense rather than on getting hit because you have headgear on.
Yeah, so that is also something I heard about, because you have a lot of different, especially in amateur fights, like you're saying, where they wear headgear. And again, all of that is to appease people who don't understand what's actually happening. And that's what's making it so bad. People who have no idea what's actually happening, who aren't doctors, who aren't athletes, who are sitting on the sidelines and going, "Oh, that looks scary. They should be wearing headgear. They should be wearing a helmet. They should be wearing padding on their head because they're going to get injured." It's like, no. Really, they're going to get injured more, and that's what they were finding. And segue this over into something else we got to talk about here, which is kind of boxing versus MMA. And I think that one of the reasons, not to say there isn't an issue in MMA, because there absolutely is, and we're going to get to that. However, in boxing, I do think the problem is worse, and I think the problem is worse. I was actually talking to a guy, his name is Jordan Young. He fights in Bellator, and him and I just randomly got on this conversation. I don't even know how it happened, but him and I just got on this conversation. And one of the things that he said, which is something I had never thought about, which is in boxing, when you get when you get your head rattled, you have 10 seconds to recover. And so look at MMA. If you gave someone who got pummeled to the ground, if the ref waved it off and gave that person 10 seconds, those fights would keep going. The mass majority of those fights would keep going, because those guys could probably recover in about 10 seconds. So, and you're going to take way more damage.
Yeah. I would say that that's a component, and I have never thought of that. But the fact that you can get a standing 8 in certain states and actually get 10 seconds before they count you out, I would say that that's a factor. I think that,
and the heavily padded gloves would be my other one.
Yes, no question about it. I think that there's several things in MMA that should be concerning to the organizations and the fighters. One is that you can use knees and elbows, so the force of the impact is significantly higher than it would be with even the small gloves that they use in MMA. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is that I think that, with the exception of a few fighters, from a fan's perspective, there's not enough emphasis paid to defense. I think that the guys get hit more in MMA than they would in other sports like kickboxing and boxing. I think the guys that pay a lot more attention to defense and obviously get hit less are at a lower risk just because of that. So I think those are the two main components that kind of jump out at me with the difference between the MMA and you can also get slammed to the ground in MMA, which you can't get in boxing, and that's a different type of concussion.
Yeah, your head bouncing off the canvas is something that well, I know in football a lot of the concussions come from their heads hitting the field, and it's not necessarily the initial contact, it's their head slamming into the turf afterward. Yeah, so yes. Absolutely.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. So yeah, I think MMA is such a hugely popular sport that I think that the powers that be with the organizations, they have to start taking a much closer look at how they can protect the fighters, because the fighters are athletes and they're going to get in there no matter what. They have that warrior mentality. So it's up to the people that are guiding them and are running the organizations, including their coaches, to really bear down and try to establish the best environment of protection for them that they can.
Real quick, let's define a concussion real quick, and let's also correct me if I'm wrong. There is no distinction, because we hear certain, especially with war, because we've been in a war for over a decade, well over a decade. I guess coming up on 15 years now, which is crazy. That's a whole nother podcast. But so we've heard the term TBI a lot. I think everybody's familiar with the term TBI now. Correct me if I'm wrong. There's no distinction between a TBI and a concussion, correct?
Yeah, they're both. One is the acronym is traumatic brain injury, right? So
yes.
The definition for a concussion for the longest amount of time was when, basically, to simplify it, the brain was rattled around in the skull so that it banged up against the side of the skull, and you had a lesion or damage to the brain tissue. And that was kind of like the standard definition of a concussion. But now it's much broader because it includes, you don't necessarily have to have damage to the brain. It can show up on a CAT scan. You can be knocked out or have symptoms such as nausea, balance problems, headaches. Those are all can be defined as a concussion. And then to further define it, they go into subconcussive trauma, which means that, if they image the brain, you can have that damage without any of the symptoms at all. So it's constantly evolving, to be very fair. And the definition, along with the research, is changing rapidly. And I would guess that in the next couple of years, you're going to have several different types of concussions and levels of those concussions based on the information that they're getting from the imaging and just data in general.
Incredible. And what's amazing is how little we still know about the brain. I mean, the brain is essentially the ocean. I mean, we know so little. We think we know so much, but at the end of the day, we really know so little. And it's incredible. It's going to be interesting to see, and let's use this, a perfect transition into kind of what we forecast for the MMA, because the MMA, UFC, Pride and stuff, this is still relatively in its infancy. You didn't start seeing major boxing things. It took a long, long time. We're not quite there yet with MMA. We don't know what effect this is really going to have as far as CTE is concerned, which we could talk about CTE here too. Tons of stuff to talk about with this. That's why I'm having you on. There's so much about concussions to talk about, and it's something that I don't know. Yeah. It seems so taboo. You never hear. You hear it all the time in football now. That's all they talk about. There was a movie called Concussion with Will Smith in it, for God's sakes, right? Like, in football, we're really, really talking about concussions. And obviously with the military and TBI, we're really, really focused on brain trauma. I don't ever hear anybody talk about it in MMA. I hardly ever hear. You're one of the very few people who is actually kind of talking about it. I mean, to me, I'm not saying there aren't a lot of people, so don't get me wrong. It's not getting back to me. So it still must be a relatively small sect.
Yeah, well, I think, there's a couple of good things happening. I know that the UFC hiring Jeff Novitzky as their director of human performance, it's a good thing because he's sort of an outsider with a different background coming in. And he, from what I've heard, I've never met him, but I've heard him speak and read several articles that he was quoted on. He's really concerned with the athlete's safety as well. And so they're going to look at a lot of different things that have an impact on your risk factor for a concussion. They're going to look at, nutrition and hydration in the different camps. They're going to look at something which I think is a big elephant in the room, which is making weight, which makes you highly at risk for a concussion if you are dehydrating a certain amount before a fight.
And that because your brain's
used to doing.
Your brain's dried out, correct? Yeah.
Yeah, basically what happens is that when you dehydrate to make weight like that, basically your body doesn't want your heart to stop. And, systemic function, it just doesn't want it to stop. So it starts taking water from other areas, and it takes water. It takes hydration and water from your brain. So you can't rehydrate fast enough, and you make yourself more susceptible to basically having leather for tissue. And that's not a good thing if you're going to get hit. So I think that's one of the things that they have to look at, and hopefully they will. The other thing that they have to look at, if I'm consulting with a fighter, I'm looking seriously at their annual preparation, and I'm looking at that they probably don't need to spar as much going into camp. I think that, as much damage, if not more, is all the sparring that gets done, not just in the fight. So I know there's a couple of guys that are in the UFC that publicly have said, look, I'm not doing as much sparring as I did before, if any at all. So that's another thing I look at. Nutrition is vital for the guys that aren't paying attention to that. Just eating well to keep the inflammation process down is really important. So there's a lot that can be done.
But say conversely, I read an article today with Benil Dariush, who trains at King's MMA, and he was talking about how they spar really, really, really hard and why he thinks that's a good thing. So it's like, okay, there's no one is ever going to be able to, not even even outside concussions, no one's going to be able to convince. Now I'm not a fighter, so my opinion really doesn't matter. But no one's going to be able to convince me that hard sparring is a good thing. It's not. You're basically doing a bunch of damage to your body for free. You're not even getting paid for it. I mean, hell, at least get paid for the damage you're doing to your body. You know, and you're shortening your career.
And for your audience, it's, you know, people will say, well, why? You know, you're going to get ready. Well, it's because of the repetitive hits and that terminology that they're referring to now, subconcussive trauma. Which means that if you and I are running a camp and we have X amount of fighters in our camp and we do a bunch of hard sparring, they may not even be symptomatic. They may not have headaches. They may not have problems with balance. They may not have dizziness or nausea, anything outward that would indicate to you or I that there was an issue, but they're suffering that on a consistent basis. And what they're seeing now is that that's a huge risk factor. Sometimes more, some studies indicate that a higher risk factor than actually having a bad concussion is all the subconcussive trauma. That's where the problem lies.
Yeah.
So you have camps like, I believe it was John Kavanaugh who started to look at certain types of imaging on his fighters. And I think that's really smart. And I think that's really ballsy and progressive. To be able to use what's out there right now to determine whether or not your athletes are at risk without even knowing it.
Well, and didn't they find something with Aisling Daly? Didn't she just retire because of a head issue? I'm pretty sure. Who trains out of SBG. I wonder if they caught it.
I think he's had a few fighters retire because of the imaging issue and what they saw. Yeah, I think so.
Which is incredible.
That's progressive.
It's very much so.
Yeah.
Good for him, man.
Yeah,
I had heard.
Yep.
Yeah, good for him. I had heard about that, but I wasn't quite. I'm pulling up an article right now to see if I could figure out kind of what her was. Yeah, so routine brain scan of an abnormality, a small hemorrhage that must have taken place in the last few months. So she basically said, all right. You know, basically said it would be unlikely that she could be medically cleared. However, the possibility is that she could. So she's just saying, listen, let's just call it a day. You know, which is really sad for someone like that. But at least he's doing that. At least they found it.
Yeah, it's smart. I mean, because, again, what your audience has to understand is that you don't have to have symptoms. If your job or, you know, as a fighter is, you know, to take contact and to give contact, and you've accepted your share, then you need to know what's going on upstairs and, you know, make an educated decision. Because after fighting, you want to have a life, and that's what they're seeing now in football. You know, they're seeing, you know, not even NFL players, NCAA players, players that played in high school, that suffered a lot of repetitive hits, had evidence of CTE.
And then I think there's also some evidence that ALS could also be caused by a lot of this head trauma as well. So
that's what they're looking at now. Yeah. In fact, ALS is ALS. The first documented case it's called Lou Gehrig's disease because it was Lou Gehrig who did catcher for the New York Yankees. And if you look back at the news, he had, I believe it was 9 documented concussions, and he was like out cold, and he played the next day or shortly thereafter. They're definitely looking at the causes of different issues like that relative to the amount of trauma that you've taken.
Yeah, and they've made connections with, there seems to be, this is all kind of, all very unscientific, of course, but there also just seems to be a higher or a more concentrated population of ALS with athletes. And there's really, they can't figure out what the connection is quite yet, but they will, they'll figure it out eventually. But it does seem like there's a connection there. And this isn't to scare fighters, right? Like, that's not what you're trying to do. You're not trying to scare fighters.
Oh, no.
It's about listen, this is something
fan.
You need to be conscious of.
Yeah, no, I'm a huge fan. And I'm looking at it from, obviously, being someone who's in the field, I'm looking at it because I'm working with athletes from different disciplines, and it just so happens that I'm very interested in the fighting sports. But also just from the fact that if you get an athlete that you're consulting with, what's the best advice you can give them? I mean, they're going to fight. So, what kind of global approach can you take to mitigate the risk factor to protect yourself as much as possible? So that's what I'm looking at. I'm saying, okay, you're gonna fight, and that's just the way it is. What can you do? And these are certain things that you can do. I mean, you have to look at it in the big picture.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the questions I want to ask you too, because this is something that I've heard different things. Here, you hear a lot of people say, "Oh, it's just a minor concussion," or you hear someone say, "Oh, it's a really bad concussion." Okay. But I've heard other outlets who have said, yeah, there's no difference. There's no such thing as a minor concussion. There's no such thing as a major concussion. It's you have a concussion or you don't have a concussion. So in your experience and your knowledge, is one of those right, or is it somewhere in the middle?
I think that I would lean towards you have a concussion or you don't have a concussion. I think that, again, you can have a concussion without having outward symptoms of a concussion. And I think that's what those people look at, or you didn't have a concussion because you weren't knocked out, or you didn't have nausea, or you didn't have headaches, or you passed the sideline or neuropsychological tests, which are the, kind of the industry gold standard, where they give you these cognitive tests, but that's not an indicator of whether or not you've had a concussion. So I think you either had one or you didn't, and I think that the way that the research is going, it's going to boil down to they're going to do urine, they might do blood tests, and they're going to scan the brain with different types of imaging, and they'll tell you right away, listen, you suffer trauma, this shows, or they're going to take baseline on all the athletes, and they'll be able to compare the baseline to, post-event, that type of thing. But I lean more towards you either got concussed or you didn't get concussed.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's probably more accurate. I kind of have a feeling that you'll see sideline kind of handheld machines that test for concussions, test for blood flow, kind of like you have like the not thermodynamic, but what, like the infrared thermometers, where you can hold it away from someone's head and get their temperature. I wonder if you're going to have that for testing for concussions, where it kind of tests for blood flow, or that's kind of, I think that's the direction they're going to start going, because this is going to cost at the end, money talks. Okay. Money talks. We all know this. Money talks. That's the only reason why like a Mayweather-McGregor fight is even possible, right? Because money talks. Right. And no regional or no boxing commission would ever sanction, a 50-0 fighter to fight an 0-0 fighter. No commission would ever do that unless there's $1 billion at stake. Then all of a sudden they'll find a way to do it. So I don't know if you would ever have a sideline concussion tester, machine, except for the fact that this is going to cost the NFL billions over the next who knows how long. So them trying to figure this out might quicken that process a little bit, right? Capitalism, you know, like let's pump a lot of money into research. Let's try to figure this out so we can save ourselves money, you know, down the line. I wonder if that's going to be something. I don't know. Maybe you know, maybe I should get into that. Maybe I should figure out how to make that machine because I can make a lot of money.
You'd make a ton of money. There's a couple of companies already, either through EEG or they're making portable PET scans, or there's different types of brain imaging that they're looking at to bring to the sideline, like you said. And you know, it's just about right now. Everyone's gathering information, whether it be MMA or soccer or NFL, and then the organizations are looking at their liability. You know, they're looking at, okay, how can we protect these guys without assuming too much liability? And at the end of the day, it's a business, so you
don't want to acknowledge it.
That's right. If you are giving your guys way too much care, I don't care if it's the MMA or if it's, you know, the FIFA, then you're assuming more responsibility. And, you know, then it's money down the line. It's risk for them. So they're kind of dancing around it and gathering information. And, you know, from my perspective, I'm with the team that doesn't want to wait to see, you know, what comes out in the wash. In the meantime, there are plenty of athletes that need a lot of help, because they've suffered multiple trauma, and they come to you and they, you know, hey, I've been everywhere and I haven't really gotten a lot of help, and you know, I want to participate in my sport, or I just want to feel better, and you know, and there's few places that have answers for them. So that's kind of why I stepped into this arena, and hopefully, you know, can provide some positive, you know, results.
Wonderful. Man, unfortunately, we're kind of running out of time here. I got a busy day today. We're going to have to probably make this a two-parter because I have a lot more questions. One more question I do want to ask while I'm thinking about it. I'm going to have to go back and listen to this so I can figure out all the questions I missed. But let me at least ask one question. Every time someone gets knocked out, so, and there's obviously a difference between getting knocked out and getting stunned maybe, or, you know what I mean? Like, obviously you can get a fight stopped where you're not unconscious. But I have a question. Every time, if you get hit and you go unconscious, is that a concussion or is it case by case?
It's case by case. I mean,
okay.
You know, I take that back. It could be classified as a concussion, but when you get hit on the button in the jaw and you get knocked out, it should be classified as a concussion, but it doesn't always get classified as a concussion. And I know that I cheaped out on that answer, but that's one of those things they're looking at now, is whether to classify different types of knockouts as a concussion or not a concussion. And, you know, getting hit on the button in the jaw, you can be put out and, you know, your brain is perfectly fine. And it has to do more with a different type of wiring coming from your jaw to your brain. But, yeah, it should be considered a concussion until further research. Let's put it that way.
Okay. And that's one of the big things. And if there's anything to take away from this, which is there's no easy answer, you know, to whether someone does or does not have a concussion. In order to figure it out, you have to do research you have to do scans of the brain, and that's not something that's super easy to do. You know, that does take time, and it costs some money, and so we just need to keep getting events. Is there a not a charity, but is there an organization that you work for or work with, or that you would say, hey, if you do care about this issue, go donate money here? Is there anything like that you know about?
Yeah, you guys can. A friend of mine is the chairperson of the Sports Legacy Foundation. His name is Chris Nowitzki, and they're the ones that really kind of blew the doors open on CTE. And you can go on their website. It's called Sports Legacy, and donate money there. And you know, and fighters can even put themselves on a list to donate their brains when they go. So that's two things you can do. And you know, for MMA, for the fighters, for me, the the big takeaway for your audience is, listen, pay attention to the amount of sparring you're doing. Work on your defense. Don't get hit. That's the easiest way not to get damage, is not to get hit. And work on your defense. And make sure that your nutrition is on point. Those three things, short of telling about exercises on the phone, those are the three takeaways that your audience can, walk away from.
Awesome. And the one probably most surprising one is make sure your nutrition's on point, to kind of circle back to that. Mm-hmm. That's a really good point. It's something that I had heard that before. I'm glad you said it. It reminded me of that. I've heard that. But yeah, I mean, the more dehydrated you are, the more susceptible you're making your brain, which is really interesting. I bet you that's something a lot of people don't know.
Absolutely. You're right.
So wonderful. All righty. Well, Ben, we definitely got to get you back on because that wasn't long enough. But unfortunately, I got a packed day today, so I've been feel like I'm running the mud all day.
You got it.
So, all right, Ben, thank you for joining me. Anything you want to plug before you go?
No, I mean, your audience can find me on Facebook. Just type in Ben Velazquez, or on Twitter. And, I'll try to post as much information as I can as it comes out or as I'm working with athletes. And, just whatever questions they have or interest, they can reach out to me there.
Awesome, Ben. All right, we will talk again soon, my friend.
Okay, thank you, buddy. Have a good night.
Yes, sir. Take care.
The host of the LoudMouth MMA podcast, Kyle Steele. Executive producer and head of marketing, Philip Herman. Today's episode was mixed by Danny Adams, myself. Special thanks to the MMA Prophet, Sean Ihaz, Dave Madden, Keith from the MMA Takeover, the Harmony Acres Soap Company, and the Vobal. To learn more about the LoudMouth MMA podcast, please visit loudmouthmma.com.